You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 45, and I am joined today by Dr. Susan Sherrod. She is a certified senior ecologist, a professional wetland scientist, and a certified ecological restoration practitioner. And she works as a senior ecologist for Biohabitats, an organization out of Colorado, but you do work all over the country, maybe all over the world. So welcome, Susan, and thank you for being on.
Thanks, Jennifer. Nice to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about ecological restoration. But before we get into that, can you kind of give us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got into this work, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, if it can be done in a nutshell, I'd be glad to. I have an undergrad degree in biology, and at the time I didn't know if that would lead me to med school or more environmental work. And surprise, I wound up taking the environmental track. I took a little time between undergrad and grad school, and then wound up joining the program at CU Boulder in their environmental biology program, and that's where I got my graduate degree. My professional work was interrupted by having kids. Zero regrets, not necessarily recommended, but fabulous time being with the little ones. And then when I got back into the workforce, I started by doing volunteer work. And that was a great way to network and get to know people in the local restoration and conservation community, which led me to Biohabitats.
Yeah, that's always, I always tell people, if you can volunteer, do it as much as you can so that you build those networks, because that is a great way to kind of get your face out there and get them to know you. So.
And to this day, I teach at CU Denver, and I thankfully get to stay in touch with a lot of my students. And when they're looking for work, it's not always what they want to hear, but I do tell them you have to get out and volunteer, because it's the best way to get boots on the ground experience plus network, and it's that's really important.
Yeah, it's good to hear for those that are looking to work in the field, or people like myself who need the reminder that are in school. So.
Right.
Well, great. So you've done a little bit of everything, it sounds like. So tell us about what you're doing now, I guess, and the kind of work that Biohabitats does, I guess, and what ecological restoration is.
Sure. Okay. So Biohabitats, we do ecological restoration, which I know you and I are going to talk about more. We also do conservation planning and what we call regenerative design. And the company is about a third each, the technical staff anyway, being engineers, planners, and scientists. And we all work collaboratively and in a teamwork format to pursue our projects. Ecological restoration, the definition that was developed by the Society for Ecological Restoration, I actually took some notes before you and I met. And this should roll off my tongue because I've been in the field for so long, but I had to look it up anyway. Ecological restoration is assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And so that is the operating definition, and I personally just think of it as improving the ecological function of a habitat at the end of the day. And you can measure that in different ways, what that ecological function looks like.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said that there's a variety of different roles at the organization you work at that play into making that happen, I guess. So it's not just like one type of scientist does it. It's a team that has to.
Exactly. And a great example is some of the work we've done on rivers. Colorado Front Range. For those of you that don't know the state, we have the mountains and the plains meet along a north-south boundary, really, and that's called the Front Range. And there are a number of rivers that drain the mountains that then join the South Platte or the Arkansas. And we've done a fair bit of restoration work on some of those rivers, and those are perfect examples of many brains coming together. So we oftentimes have an engineer on the team, and we'll have a fluvial geomorphologist on the team, landscape architect, a GIS specialist, an ecologist. That would be my role. And those projects don't get done without all of our contributions.
So, I guess, what is the process if you identify
Okay.
a site that needs to be restored and you guys
Mhm.
come in? Kind of, can you walk us through what that looks like, what needs to be done? I know it'll vary from site to site, but I
Sure.
guess what's your initial assessment?
Right. So broadly speaking, and of course, it's going to, like you said, it's going to vary from site to site. But broadly speaking, first um, task is to identify the goals of the client. What do we want to wind up with, and budget is an important piece of that. So how much room do we have um, to uh, to how close can we get to pie in the sky? What's the ideal, and how close can we get to that? um, and so then we'll start by doing a site assessment and evaluating what condition the site is in based on the tools that we have to work with. And then we come together and we'll come up with a concept. And it might be ambitious, or it might be modest. And again, that's sort of trained by what we understand the client's um, goals are, as well as what kind of financial and community support's an important piece of that too. Sometimes we need to reach out to the community and find out, what's the political landscape like, and within those opportunities and constraints, then we'll come up with a design. And oftentimes there are stages to the design. There might be like a 30% followed by a 60% design, and then a final, and that gets divvied up in different ways according to different projects. When everybody agrees to a design, then we execute, and it might involve earthwork, or it might involve uh, weed control. Um, Oftentimes, I'd say 90% of the time, revegetation is an element of a restoration project. So again, that's a very, very general framework of a restoration project.
Okay. So, what are some of the reasons you might need to restore a site? Is it, you know, human caused? We destroyed, we dumped a lot of stuff and killed everything,
Yep.
or is it things overgrow, or kind of maybe a combination of everything, anything
Yeah.
like
So,
that?
yeah, great question. And so one thing that we're dealing with in Colorado is not um, uh, exceptional in this case, but there are a lot of natural disturbances happening everywhere. So fires are a natural disturbance that we have to recover from. Flooding, um, and we deal with both of those natural disturbances here in Colorado, and then other geographies have different natural disturbances that they need to recover from. Oftentimes, these disturbances are compounded by the human presence, which may or may not include development or management history. So, if we take the case of fire, for example, oftentimes the fires in Colorado are more catastrophic than they would have been, say, a couple of centuries ago, because we have this history of fire suppression that has allowed fuels to build up. Excuse me. The fuel load to build up, and once you have a high fuel load, then the fires burn hotter, and with the higher temperatures, that gets into burning soil organic matter. And so that's a degree of disturbance that is kind of a new territory for the West, just because we have these high fuel loads in the forests. Um, Went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but anyway, some of the restoration needs are dictated by this intersection of natural disasters with the human management history. And then also we have just development that's been stressing our ecosystems. In the case of some of the rivers, they've been channelized or straightened, and there might have been development that have raised the banks of a river. So instead of having a nice broad floodplain, the banks are relatively steep and narrow, limiting the amount of space that water can travel through. So development is an element that sometimes there's an opportunity to restore a habitat, even with nearby development. Weeds are a big issue in invasive species, and sometimes a restoration project is focused on simply removing invasive species.
Mm.
Um, let's see, mining. We're talking a lot about transferring our fossil fueled cars to electric vehicles, and from a carbon standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. And it's going to entail more mining of precious earth metals. So, hopefully there are restoration visions incorporated into some of those operations. So,
And nothing has no solution to the climate crisis is without some consequence, right? There's going to be
probably
something
so.
you gotta address.
Right, and on that point, with the climate crisis, the warming oceans are causing the coral bleaching, and the acidification is a byproduct of higher carbon dioxide, and that is causing a breakdown of calcareous shells in coral. So climate change is causing a great need for restoration in the oceans too. So that's kind of a short list of a potentially very long one for why we need restoration in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of jumping ahead, I think, but
Yeah.
since we're talking about it, this restoration has the potential to sequester a lot of carbon, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the soil, the trees that you plant, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how
Sure.
that can positively impact, the
Sure.
or
Yeah.
reverse the trends we're seeing?
Yeah. Well, on the matter of carbon, there are a number of tools that can be used to mitigate climate change as opposed to adapt to climate change. And yeah, carbon storage is um, a big piece of our a big tool in our toolbox, if you will, and we can apply that to different habitats. So planting trees seems like a pretty familiar concept, but we need to look at our soils, because soils are a huge repository of carbon, and they store more carbon depending. They store different quantities of carbon depending on the habitat you're looking at. So wetlands store vast amounts of carbon, because the decomposition rates of materials are a little slower in wetlands, and so the carbon that adds to a wetland builds up over time. And in that, I'm including peatlands.
Mhm.
And there are
We have a
some
lot of those in
Sorry?
a lot of bogs.
Yeah,
Bogs and
right.
peat in Ireland and England. That's pretty cool.
Exactly. And I don't know if you've done any searches on peatland conservation and restoration groups, but it's a pretty active territory for restoration work. Is restore our peatlands or save our
So
peatlands.
important.
And from a carbon storage standpoint, there's almost no beating it. But also prairie soils. Prairie soils are very, very deep, because the root masses of plants go so deep in the prairies, and uh, so we need to use all of these different habitats and diversify our carbon storage tools
Mhm.
in order to maximize carbon storage as a climate change mitigation approach.
Yeah, it's amazing how we're trying to think of all these new technologies to solve this issue, but nature has given us
Yep.
the best and the easiest, really. I mean, if we
Yep.
just actually listen to her and implement these things, who would think, oh, just don't till the land, just plant some more plants. And,
Right.
doing simple things can actually have a big difference in keeping the carbon in the soil or in the plant, in the ground, and not releasing more. And
Exactly, and it's not that these soils have to be do not touch. We can still use them, and I'm thinking of like regenerative agriculture,
Mhm.
which is designed in order to, keep even build carbon in the soils. And so, we can still use these areas. They don't have to be uh, unapproachable.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so cool that you basically helping the earth do what it does best, and just identifying, what needs to be re-implemented and restored, I guess. It seems very rewarding.
It's a wonderful opportunity, and it's kind of one habitat at a time. The climate change, um, oh, stress, if you will, is a real thing, and I think we're seeing it more and more, not only in our communities but in our clientele. And I think instead of despairing, we need to see this as an opportunity to work together and come together as a team and work on it, because no single one of us is going to do it all.
Right.
Yeah,
And we know what to do. So yeah, if we have
yeah,
more people working on it, it's not as overwhelming.
right, exactly, right. And
Yeah.
from a community standpoint, it's such a huge opportunity too. Having a common goal, regardless of other differences, it's very unifying, I think.
So are your clients typically governments or businesses, or kind of a combination? And are they hiring you guys because they have to, like, meet a standard, or just because they want to do the right thing? Is it, what do
Yeah.
you, I guess,
It's
see?
it's all of those things, and variety of clientele and variety of motives, but we do have a number of clients that represent a government, whether large or more local. Um, we also work with development companies that want to have a zero carbon footprint or a fully sustainable development. One example is in South San Francisco, and I think I better not use client names just because I don't know if I have permission to, but they want to have a completely sustainable community, and we're consulting, and we know that there's sea level rise in the area, and we also are working on a contaminated site. So we have lots of goals with this one project, and it's
Mhm.
also on the order of 700 or 800 acres, so it's big. Um, but we know how to do this,
Yeah.
and even though it's a development, um, we have the opportunity to improve habitat for endangered butterflies that are nearby, and to restore some wetlands, so that, back to the carbon story there. And from the standpoint of sea level rise, it's an opportunity to build up the coastal wetlands, like tidal marshes and seagrasses, which are going to be instrumental in protecting these land masses from encroaching tides.
Yeah.
So that's a neat opportunity. And then we also have other clients that are, they're developing, and they're definitely in real estate, but they do have an ethic, motivated by sustainability and habitat, and they see themselves as leaders, and they want to set the standard for developing responsibly.
Okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
encouraging to know that there are developers and businesses out there
Uh-huh.
that are looking to do the right thing by nature. Because I think
Mhm.
all we hear are the horror stories sometimes. So
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I don't know how the numbers balance, but yes, they're the ethically. I shouldn't. I don't want to imply that there are those that are unethical, but the broad-minded uh, considerations are definitely out there.
So if I'm a consumer looking to buy a house or use a
Mhm,
developer to build, a
mhm.
building, is there like a certification or just a specific
Yeah,
set of standards I can look for?
yeah. Yeah, so we do a lot of work with it's the Green Building Council, and they oversee the LEED process, LEED, leadership, and I'm gonna botch the acronym, but the LEED um, certification method, yeah, that does give different tiers
Mhm.
of recognition and sustainability ratings, but that really is the gold standard by which buildings can be built and meet sustainability criteria. Since I'm an ecologist, I don't advise on that personally. We do have people in the company that do, but I do work on projects that are centered around a lead development, and I might advise on the open space, for example, and how to create a restored open space that's consistent with these not only sustainable ethics or yeah, that's okay. I'm shying away from using the word ethic, um, but also consistent with the native habitat and being respectful of the landscape.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have an episode on LEED, probably last year. So if anybody's interested in learning more about that, or, just Google it. There's a lot of information, but yeah, that's a great program. So, so can we talk, I guess, a little bit about some of your projects? I know you focus on kind of river restoration projects, correct?
Well, I have a fair bit of experience on that in Colorado, and I wouldn't say that's an exclusive focus, but we have done a lot of river restoration. I was hired by Biohabitats right after the catastrophic floods of 2013. And so there was a lot of opportunity to do post disturbance work like that. So, circumstances came together, and I'm glad to tell you more about that.
Yeah, I guess what are what does that consist of, or what are some of the special considerations that might you might have to take when you're doing work on river areas?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that sometimes the rivers are built up and channelized. So it's nice if there can be a broad floodplain for first of all, so the river can move a little bit because they're not intended to be they're not designed to be stationary features, but also with fluctuating flows, there's always going to be a high flow, especially following snowmelt, which that starts to happen around June or so, and we see the high waters here. There needs to be room to hold those volumes of water, and those volumes of water carry a lot of energy with them. So if the channel is confined and constrained, suddenly you have a lot of volume with a lot of energy going through a restricted space. Think of like a hose, and there's nowhere for the volume or the energy to go, and that's when we have there might be a structure taken out or some erosion that causes damage to a building or a road or a bridge or something, and of course people can be hurt. So it's nice if the floodplain can be bigger, and sometimes we achieve that by doing earthwork if we can. Sometimes the option to do that isn't there because of infrastructure or a building or ownership issues. If the city owns one side of a river and a private property owner owns the other side, you can only do so much. So that's one consideration to take into account. And then, and I'm Jennifer. I'm mixing the two things. You asked me about considerations, and then there are also techniques. So I think I'm going to try to hodgepodge them all together here. Let's see here. We also want to incorporate more wetlands because they're a natural part of the riparian zone. And when I talk about the riparian zone, that refers to the habitat that depends on the hydrology of the river. It might not be wet, but the roots of those plants that are growing in the riparian zone do need the hydrology, whether direct contact with groundwater or capillary action or something. So, and you can see across the landscape, it's pretty easy to identify where the riparian zone is if it hasn't been modified, just because you see more trees growing
Mhm.
next to the river, that's going to be the riparian zone. So we want to diversify habitat from that standpoint to partly to make the river more natural and functioning, partly to dissipate energy that could otherwise take out infrastructure or buildings, and partly for the wildlife,
Mhm.
um, just to give them some habitat. So the riparian zone might be forested, it might be herbaceous wetland, but we try to create as much diversity in there as we can. Um, it's nice to have a curvature in the river without having straightened channels, or you don't want too sharp of a curve either, because then you're setting up the conditions for erosion. So that's where our fluvial geomorphologist is so important, because that person, in our case, he understands the natural dynamics and the meanders in the most accommodating meanders of a river that can help contain that.
Yeah, we
So,
humans
yeah,
like to try to force nature to be
uh-huh,
nice and neat, and
yeah,
nature's not
uniformity,
made to do that.
right,
She likes to wander and cut new paths, and confining it
exactly.
doesn't work.
Exactly, and I think we're starting to understand, following, some bad floods or some bad fire seasons, that we only have so much control.
Yeah.
But with respect to other considerations, with some of these river restoration projects here locally, typically there are people nearby. And we've already mentioned that, but there might be a recreation trail, there might be houses, there might be development or roads. And so we need to understand what those public or private uses are of the river and accommodate that. And that's where these communications with the public or private property owners can become so important. And I really like that part of my job. I like understanding the other concerns that people might have as we approach a restoration project. Water rights can be an issue. There are long-standing water rights that we need to respect, and we can't modify it all. And sometimes, if you're building, if we might say um, create a wetland habitat, we need to check the hydrology on that and make sure it's not going to impact downstream flows. So that can also be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then back to some of the techniques, Jennifer. Like I mentioned earlier, there might be some earthwork to possibly realign the river, possibly create a broader floodplain, and then certainly there's going to be planting. We'll
Mhm.
come in after much of the heavy construction is done, and bring in trees and shrubs and herbaceous species. They come in little plugs, maybe with 8 inches of root mass. We call it a 10 cubic inch plug, and seed. We'll bring in seed, and there's another tool that we like to use called wetland sod mats, and those are for specialized situations where it's a little bit more stable, but it's a lot of plant biomass. Um, it's pretty ready to establish if it doesn't get disturbed, and they're 5 meters by 1 meter, and all we need to do is secure them to the soil, and if the hydrology is there, they establish quickly,
Okay.
and we've had some success with those too. So that's a very quick way of describing how we bring in some of the vegetation, and I'm glad to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, what's the importance of the vegetation in particular in water areas and flood mitigation and maybe
Mhm.
filtering the water and stuff like that?
Oh,
'Cause
good. Yeah. So that's one reason right there, is water quality. And then another reason is to stabilize the banks, because the soil around water is not going to be stable if there's not vegetation there, or rock. But
Mhm.
we prefer to stabilize banks with vegetation where we can, just because the riprap is hardened, and it doesn't allow for much in the way of habitat opportunities. Um, So, and then another reason for vegetation is to provide wildlife habitat. Um, and I think broadly speaking, those are the primary reasons. And the design is going to depend on the site, but like I mentioned earlier, we might have a patch that's wetland, and that means that it's going to be saturated most, if not all, of the time. So that would take a certain suite of species.
Mhm.
And then we might have riparian forest, which is a little bit different than a wetland per se. And in that case, we would have canopy trees. In Colorado, we use a lot of cottonwoods and um, and peach leaf willows are probably the biggest trees we plant along rivers. But then we also bring in subcanopy trees
Mhm.
in order to provide that understory and herbaceous species as well. So there's a lot of vertical structure, and so that's good for long-term hydrology in that it can kind of buffet some of the energy brought by high flows and reduces the chances of damage downstream.
Mhm.
And then also it stabilizes the banks and provides the habitat. It improves air quality in addition to water quality, recreational opportunities, and so the reasons for planting like that are myriad. Oh, importantly, weed control. If you don't plant it with species that you want there, very
They'll show.
likely non-native species are going to establish, and then you have a whole different set of issues and a different restoration project at that point.
Yeah. Nature doesn't like bare earth, so she'll
Right.
put something there, whether you want it,
That's
whether it's
right.
what you want or not.
That's right. So we try to kind of uh, you know uh, import our desired community, and if we're lucky, we get to, we always advise that the site managers watch it for a while because um, it's not uncommon for there to be weeds that happen in the first 2 or 3 years, and if they can get on top of those weeds um, quickly, then the chances for a long-term sustainable native community are that much better.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
Um, well, anything else about, I guess, the work that you do or the projects that you've done that we haven't touched on, or?
So, I did, let me look at my notes really quickly. Sometimes we do bring in soil. If the soils are poor quality or low in organic matter or contaminated, we might need to bring in good quality soil. So that can be part of a restoration project. Um, Wildlands Restoration Volunteers is a group that I volunteer for out of Boulder, and they like to use a feature called Z-dyke structures, Zeedyke, and they use those to slow down water flow. So it's not bringing in like a backhoe and changing the entire structure of a floodplain. They're simply putting it along a drainage to spread the water out, and passively over time, um, that can adjust local hydrology and create habitat for those localized species. Um, some of our post-fire work in Colorado, again through Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, um, has the after a burn, we might go in and simply seed it and mulch it. And prior to seeding, we rake the site first to make it, a nice little seed bed. But that is real boots on the ground, get your hands dirty, um, volunteer-based efforts
Mhm.
that can save a landscape. And that's in Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, by the way, as long as I'm mentioning them, their motto is heal the land, build community. And that's exactly what Biohabitats also believes in. So as you said earlier, I'm lucky to be in this position.
Yeah. So there's probably organizations like that all over the world, I would imagine, if
I
people
would
want to get
I
involved.
would hope so. And a good resource for that is the Society for Ecological Restoration, ser.org. They have a database of global restoration projects worldwide, and some of them are academically sponsored, some are government sponsored, but yeah, it's a pretty good database of what efforts are happening around the planet. And
Nice.
we can always use more, of course, but
Yeah. Look into that for Ireland. So
okay. Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah.
awesome. So are there ever any instances that you've encountered where restoration is just not possible? Either it's too far gone, or maybe there's other considerations like people aren't willing to do what needs to be done, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a good question. Well, so if we're having the conversation about it in the first place, it probably implies that there's an interest in restoration.
Mhm.
But I think what's pretty normal is that you can't, there you have to draw the line somewhere. And so an example I mentioned earlier is that the opportunity for restoration might be the left bank of the river, whereas you can't do anything on the right bank. So, and you can still do good work on the left bank, but it's like you just have to accept those limitations. And then another, I think universal to all of our projects is you do have a defined project area, and you're going to be working inside the boundaries of that project area, but that doesn't mean that the perimeter doesn't exist. And so part of our planning always takes into account um, the external stressors that will continue after the restoration project is done. These restored sites are always going to be under some degree of stress, whether it's climate or human stress, traffic, pollution, weeds, maybe nuisance wildlife or whatever. And so we try to project what those stressors might be and well, not accommodate, but control for that as best as we can. And one of the tools I think one of the themes that we always use to try to make a site most sustainable and stable over the long term is diversity. So I mentioned like the vertical diversity of the riparian zone, but biodiversity is important too. And by that I mean, biodiversity can cover lots of different concepts, but structural diversity is one, species diversity is another, community diversity. So not just grassland, but grassland and some wetland if you can, if the hydrology is there. And maybe we can mix in some shrubland and forest too. So the more diversity you have, the more able a site tends to be to handle stressors because it just has more tools, internal tools and internal capabilities.
Yeah. Just yeah, any time in nature, I think that's always the case.
Right.
More is better. Trying to do a monoculture or a one size fits all thing doesn't.
Right. Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
I have a question about that. Like knowing what we know now, that certain things don't work. That narrowing a river within an inch of its life is not ideal for flood control, and that fire suppression is bad in certain cases. Are people doing better? Are they, adopting new techniques when they're designing or developing around these areas? I would hope.
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I would think the answer is yes. Like right now, uh, we're more conscious of the fact that you shouldn't build a road 20 feet away from a river.
Yeah.
Not a good idea. And with some of our repair work that we've done in the Front Range, the roads that were damaged, the rebuilt road might give a little bit more space between the road alignment and the river alignment. Um, there's so much area that's already developed that the restoration is I hate to call it a retrofit, but uh, the new development is getting more and more limited. I guess I'll put it that way. And the example in South San Francisco I offered, I think that's a really great example of yes. Here's an area that is undergoing development, and we know that we have an opportunity to balance residential and community needs with some habitat opportunities, and it's very responsibly approached. And similar with a site in Utah that I'm working on with, yes, they're building buildings, but they're sustainably certified with the LEED Platinum. And instead of having a highly irrigated greenscape around it, they are restoring open space to reflect the native heritage of the site. So, I think that is the trend, and I'm not getting the cross section of developers, but I'm seeing that mindset.
Yeah, you would just like to think if you're having to go back and fix things that were done wrong, that hopefully people aren't still doing them that way. But human nature isn't always as logical.
Yeah, there are different drivers out there for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess on a related note, we've talked about a lot of things that if you're a developer or you own land that you can do to kind of, make it function better or restore it. But if you're an average person, is there anything that we can do as we're going through our lives to maybe help prevent the need for this restoration, or just, make sure we're not making it worse? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so one cool example, and this is not the green life hat question, is it, Jennifer?
No.
Well, I think it starts with education, and that needs to be self-motivated.
Mhm.
But it's what's fresh on my mind is yesterday I took my students out to the urban farm in Denver, and it's theurbanfarm.org. Fabulous place that is working with youth that need this outlet, as well as contributing food to the community. Last year, they contributed 11,000 pounds of vegetables that they grew on site, and so the reason I bring this up is they have a prairie dog problem, and the reason they have a prairie dog problem is because the prairie dogs have been pushed out of their habitat from a nearby housing development. And so in the residents of the housing development are charmed by the prairie dogs and don't want them to be relocated or otherwise controlled. And the irony is that the prairie dogs wouldn't be so much of an issue if it weren't for the houses that are there. So I think we can always start with educating ourselves on the issues and how complicated they really are. And how we might be contributing to that knowingly or unknowingly.
Mhm.
And getting involved. I actually, you know what? I forgot your question.
Just ways that the average person could maybe prevent or help,
Prevent or help. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are lots of opportunities to help. As you and I spoke earlier, volunteer groups are active, and I'm speaking locally, of course, but to your point, I hope that there are similar volunteer groups active in different places, and that's a matter of just looking around and asking for those opportunities. Now, preventing, that's a different deal because we average citizens don't have all of the opportunities to degrade the landscape. We're just trying to function.
Yeah.
Do we buy an electric car? That doesn't really that speaks more to sustainability than it does to restoration opportunities. I think those of us that own a lot, we can manage our own properties in ways that keep it healthy.
Mhm.
But as far as influencing the need for future restoration, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's more restricted to people that are planners
Yeah.
and possibly the development sector of the economy.
Okay.
And I need to noodle on that a little bit more, but that's where I've arrived at this moment.
Yeah. Well, maybe
Yeah.
just like with everything else, our influence comes in how we vote and communicating with the people doing the work, what we want, so maybe they'll take our thoughts into consideration.
Well, you're exactly right on that. And I also I don't want to miss the opportunity, Jennifer, to mention that we really need to listen to our um, traditional populations. And I'm thinking of the Native American tribes that grew up, they understand the relationship with the land probably better than modern society does. And I see an opportunity now to establish dialogue and keep listening about how we can most respect our landscape and the natural heritage and living sustainably and respecting um, all beings beyond the human being. And so I think if I were to have one single piece of advice, it might be to start paying attention to the native voices.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because indigenous, voices are not often heard, or their advice is taken, but they're not included in the implementation process, and
Exactly,
they're
exactly.
it's kind of appropriated. So it is important that we build those relationships and listen to the people who have been managing this land for
Right,
hundreds of thousands of years.
right. And we all have just so much to learn from um, those voices. So I consider that an opportunity too.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Is there anything else we didn't get to that you want to talk about, or any resources you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I just wanted to mention, and this is shifting gears just a little bit because this conversation has been mostly on restoration, but I wanted to mention to your listeners that there is a global initiative to protect 30% of land and water globally by the year 2030.
Mhm.
And I just think we all need to take on the responsibility of learning more about that and becoming advocates for it. So quick mention of that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Ambitious, and I hope we can do it.
I hope we can too. Yeah,
It's very important.
yeah,
Okay, well, were there any other resources you would share with our
yeah.
listeners? I know you mentioned a few organizations and websites, but feel free to plug.
I do have a few more if people want to learn more. So I would go to biohabitats.com. That's the company I work for, but we do have some nice resources and it's not an overwhelming amount of information. It's a very navigable website. If you want to dive in deeper, I suggest the Society for Ecological Restoration, which I already mentioned, ser.org. They do have newsletters and webinars, and so that's if you're kind of turned on by this restoration idea and you want to learn even more about it and become more conversant, that's a great website. The UN, this is the decade on restoration, 2021 to 2030. Um, is the designated decade on restoration, and a good website for that is decadeonrestoration.org. Again, super easy to digest, and that's pretty good for now. I
Yeah,
have oodles more, but that's a good short list.
yeah, those are great. And we always put those in our show notes too. So if you are driving or
Yeah,
can't quite remember, you can come back and look at that. So I think that was all the questions that I had based on the topic at hand. I guess we will move on to our green life hacks, and
okay.
it sounds like you've got at least one planned for us. So I'm excited to hear
Yeah,
your green life hack for our listeners.
yeah, exactly. And from the ecologist standpoint, here's an easy one. You don't have to do anything. It's not doing something. Don't tidy your yard in the fall. Don't rake leaves. Don't cut things back. Don't put anything in a bag. Don't even take it to the compost. Just let it sit in place. So the leaves are going to build the carbon stores in your soil, and they're going to provide little microhabitats for little micro animals. So just leave them where they are. It's good. Um, And then, also, and anything standing, even if it's a sunflower or whatever, that is still habitat through the winter, and birds perch on it, and there might be some seeds left over that they can eat from. Okay, so that's my nut. If I had to choose one green life hack, that would be it. I have a couple more.
Feel free to share if you'd like. I love that one because I'm all about, we overcut our yards and overweed.
Yeah.
We need to kind of just let nature do its thing. And I understand people live in cities and they have rules, but.
Right. The second one is composting. And it takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of space, but it's darn interesting. Once you start turning your compost pile, you'll be an addict. And then another fun one is just buy a packet of wildflower seed and throw it out there and see what happens. It's preferable if you can buy wildflower seed that's locally native, but the pollinators need the support. There's another whole podcast for you, Jennifer, on pollinators.
Yeah.
But they support pollinators. They're pretty to look at, and they're super easy. So I have 3. That's my 3.
Okay. Well, thank you. And the seeds can go out. I guess it's December. It's technically winter, but they could go out in the fall even sometimes, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Fall or spring, so it doesn't have to be right at the beginning of spring. Yeah.
That's true. And if you're going to throw them out in the fall, throw out a little extra because somebody's bound to eat them. So.
Yeah. Sharing with nature.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I love yours. Thank you for sharing that. Mine this month isn't really related directly to the topic, but I just finished a paper actually on the right to repair. So this is fresh on my mind. So my advice to folks is just to try to repair things if you can rather than replace them. And I know that planned obsolescence makes that hard sometimes, and it's, either built to break down early or built to not update the software, or maybe you can't get the parts. But if you can repair something or make it last a little longer, please do, and try to keep it, in use in some way rather than disposing of it, even if it's recycling, because recycling is still ultimately should be one of the last steps before, reuse and repair. So
totally agree.
That's my life hack. And with the holidays coming up, a lot of times we can fix old things up and regift them. So that's a great way to keep them in cycle.
That's true. Plus, it makes us feel less helpless.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like empowering to fix something.
I know. Whenever I fix, even if it's just like a silly little thing, I'm like, I did that.
Right.
I figured out how to make that work again, even if it's dumb.
Go me. That's right.
Yeah. And that used to be the norm. It's crazy how fast that's changed in just, a couple decades, but
yeah, true.
Cheap resources will do that, I guess.
I love it.
Well, where can we find you online? You feel free to share your organization or your personal site if you'd like.
Yes. So I have a LinkedIn page, and you should just be able to find me with Susan Sherrod on LinkedIn. And then Biohabitats, it's www.biohabitats.com. And then also we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the usual.
All the things.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, you can find me here on Sustainably Geeky, occasionally on one of our other shows on the channel, Ethically or Marginally Geeky. And the show itself, of course, is on all of the sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, YouTube, and we are on pretty much every podcast channel you can find. So if you don't subscribe to us, please do, and give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up or whatever they let you do, and share us with your friends if you're so inclined. And then you can find me personally on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me. So if you have any topic suggestions or ideas, feel free to reach out either way and share those with us. Thank you again for being on and sharing your knowledge. This has been very fun and informative for me, and I'm excited to look more into some of the information you provided. So
happy holidays.
Yeah, you too. And thank you for listening, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.